In a city that prides itself on reinvention, where steel towers eclipse the clouds and fortunes evaporate as quickly as they are made, there exists a quieter story, one not told through stock tickers or political headlines, but through stone, marble, and memories. These are the stories of the lost mansions of Gilded Age New York, architectural giants once so dazzling that they stopped pedestrians mid-stride, captured newspaper headlines, and set the national tone for what wealth could look like. Today, they are gone, replaced by apartment blocks, office towers, commercial plazas, or, in some cases, nothing at all. But if you listen closely, the city still whispers their names. In this documentary, we retrace the rise and ruin of these palatial homes, uncovering why New York, arguably the world's most ambitious metropolis, chose to erase the very monuments that once defined its golden age. Through the stories of their creators, their lavish interiors, their social triumphs, and their eventual destruction, we reveal a sobering truth. Nothing in New York, not even marble carved by the finest hands or estates built by fortunes that once seemed unbreakable, is safe from the relentless march of progress. Welcome to the lost mansions of Gilded Age New York. If you love history, architecture, forgotten wealth, and the rise and collapse of America's greatest estates, be sure to subscribe, because the ghosts of old money have been waiting to tell their story. The Gilded Age, spanning roughly from the 1870s to the early 1910s, was not merely an era of economic expansion. It was a cultural performance. The nation's wealthiest families competed openly, constructing colossal homes not simply to live in, but to announce themselves. These weren't houses. They were fortresses of ego. They were symbols intended to outshine rivals. They were, in many ways, marble battlefields. At the center of this competitive architectural arena stood figures like Charles M. Schwab, William Henry Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, Clarence Mackay, Otto Kahn, and Louis Comfort Tiffany. Their mansions, once scattered across Manhattan and Long Island's Gold Coast, were manifestations of ambition. Massive structures filled with imported marbles, custom-stained glass, private art collections, indoor pools, ballrooms, organ lofts, smoking rooms, Turkish baths, and entire wings that functioned like museums. Yet, for all their extravagance, almost none survive. To understand why they fell, we must first understand why they were built. New York in the late 19th century was a new world capital of industry. Steel, oil, railroads, shipping, and finance created fortunes so immense that traditional modes of living simply could not contain them. The mansion became the ultimate display of power. It was the visible, physical proof that one's fortune was not just large, it was permanent. But nothing, as it turns out, is permanent. Consider the Charles M. Schwab Mansion, a 75-room behemoth rising from a pink granite bluff overlooking Riverside Park. In its day, it was one of the most flamboyant mansions ever erected in Manhattan, a private palace with marble halls, mahogany dining rooms, a chapel sized for an orchestra, a bowling alley, a full gym, a custom indoor pool, and 6 elevators at a time when most New Yorkers had never ridden one. More than 100 artisans labored to create carved moldings, frescoes, tapestries, and mosaics that rivaled European palaces. Even Andrew Carnegie, himself one of the richest men in American history, admitted that Schwab's mansion made his own look modest. But all this grandeur masked a fragile truth. The fortune that built the mansion depended entirely on the booming steel industry and on Schwab's own unpredictable habits. When reckless spending, gambling, and the Great Depression collided, the mansion became unmaintainable. With no buyers and mounting expenses, it deteriorated. In 1948, it was demolished and replaced with a red brick apartment complex. Schwab's monument to permanence lasted just over 40 years. The same fate befell the legendary Vanderbilt Triple Palace on Fifth Avenue. 3 interconnected mansions occupying an entire city block, once the most opulent private residences in the United States. Inside were ballrooms so large they required civil engineering, drawing rooms lined with Italian marble, art galleries curated like European museums, and dining rooms capable of hosting the most elite gatherings of the Gilded Age. The Triple Palace signaled the Vanderbilt's rise from steamship operators to America's unofficial royal family. But by the 1920s and 1930s, Fifth Avenue was transforming. Commercial giants, department stores, skyscrapers, real estate corporations offered land prices the Vanderbilt heirs could not ignore. The cost of upkeep had become crushing, and the family's fortune, once seemingly infinite, was splintered among dozens of descendants. By 1949, the Triple Palace was gone. Today, nothing of it remains, not a marble step, not a column, not even a plaque. The most expensive home in America simply vanished. Then there was Louis Comfort Tiffany's mansion, a dazzling architectural jewel built by Stanford White, filled with stained glass masterpieces, custom furniture, mosaics, turreted balconies, and a studio bathed in colored light. It was a dream carved in stone, a sanctuary for Tiffany's artistic visions. And yet, following financial strain within the Tiffany family, the mansion fell into disrepair. By 1936, despite public admiration, it too was demolished. In its absence, a seed was planted. The outrage over its destruction contributed to the birth of New York's modern landmarks preservation movement. On Long Island's Gold Coast, the story unfolded on an even grander scale. Estates like Beacon Towers, Land's End, Pembroke, Harbor Hill, and Oaxaca Castle redefined luxury. Beacon Towers resembled a medieval fortress rising above the water, a home so fantastical that F. Scott Fitzgerald modeled Gatsby's mansion after it. Pembroke hosted silent film stars and roaring 20s soirees that would later inspire the wild parties of the Great Gatsby. Harbor Hill was a palace of 80,000 square feet, commanding the cliffs of Roslyn with marble staircases, priceless art, mile-long drives, and parties so extravagant that their lights could be seen across the bay. Most of these mansions are now gone. Some were victims of the Depression. Others fell to rising taxes, skyrocketing maintenance costs, suburbanization, or simple indifference. Their marble was sold. Their beams were salvaged. Their gardens became subdivisions. In New York City itself, the final blow to America's Gilded Age architectural legacy came in the form of Penn Station, a civic palace of stone and glass, hailed as one of the greatest public buildings ever constructed. Designed by McKim, Mead, and White, it featured soaring vaults modeled on Roman baths, Doric colonnades stretching the length of a city block, and concourses illuminated by vast iron and glass skylights. It was a cathedral of transportation. And yet, because the station was privately owned and the railroad financially collapsing, it too was demolished. The destruction of Penn Station in the 1960s shocked the nation, igniting public fury. And for the first time, Americans asked, what does it mean to lose a building that defines a city? The answer led to landmark laws that eventually saved structures like Grand Central Terminal from meeting the same fate. Across these stories runs a single thread. The Gilded Age mansions of New York were never merely buildings. They were portraits of ambition, expressions of identity, monuments to fortunes that believed themselves eternal. But the city, restless and unsentimental, reshaped itself again and again. As industries faltered, as heirs dispersed, as taxes rose, as land became more valuable than stone, the mansions that once defined New York became obstacles rather than treasures. A mansion is a declaration of permanence. New York is a declaration of change. Only one of these forces could win. And so, the marble giants fell. Today, the sites where Schwab, Vanderbilt, Tiffany, and others built their palaces bear little resemblance to their former grandeur. But the stories remain, and in their absence, we find a clearer understanding of the city's evolution, its ruthlessness, and its capacity to bury even its brightest monuments beneath the demands of progress. Yet, even as these grand estates disappeared, their influence continued to echo across New York's cultural and architectural history. Their rise and fall became a mirror of the city's own transformation, a transition from a metropolis dominated by individual fortunes to one shaped by corporations, zoning laws, preservation movements, and the pressures of urban density. In tracing their stories, we uncover far more than tales of extravagant mansions. We uncover the stages upon which America's wealthiest families performed the drama of ambition, identity, and eventual decline. To truly understand the loss of these mansions, we must explore not only the buildings themselves, but the psychological landscape that produced them. The Gilded Age elite were not merely wealthy, they were insecure. Many were first-generation millionaires, social outsiders who sought legitimacy in a society still dominated by old families. Architecture became their weapon, their proof of belonging, and their attempt to carve their names into the granite of history. Cornelius Vanderbilt II understood this better than most. When he erected his colossal Fifth Avenue mansion, once the largest private residence in New York, he intended it to be nothing less than a proclamation of supremacy. Rising on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, the mansion featured soaring arches, polished marble surfaces, a private conservatory, art galleries that rivaled those of Europe, and interior woodwork hand-carved by armies of artisans brought from overseas. The dining room alone was the size of an opera house stage. Guests entered through a vaulted hall, lit by stained glass windows, crafted by the nation's most celebrated designers. It was a house built to last 1,000 years. It survived less than 50. By the 1920s, commercial expansion made the mansion's land far more valuable than the mansion itself. Fifth Avenue, once the domain of elites, had become the beating heart of New York's commercial might. Department stores like Bergdorf Goodman and Tiffany & Co. replaced private homes, transforming the avenue into the retail capital of the United States. One by one, the mansions fell, not because they were forgotten, but because they stood in the way of profit. The same pattern unfolded at the Vanderbilt Triple Palace. When Alva Vanderbilt Belmont orchestrated the opening of her 660 Fifth Avenue mansion in 1883 with the legendary Costume Ball, New York society was stunned. Gold-leaf ceilings shimmered above velvet-draped rooms. French chandeliers glowed over banquet tables, overflowing with oysters, champagne, breads, and roasts imported specifically for the event. Marble fireplaces taller than grown men flickered with candlelight. Reporters breathlessly covered the celebration. It was the social event of the century. But by the late 1930s, the fortune that built the Triple Palace had evaporated. Divided among dozens of heirs, strained by taxes, and overshadowed by corporate real estate interests, the family could no longer justify the immense costs. The mansion, once the symbol of New York's wealth, was quietly sold and destroyed. A skyscraper now occupies its footprint, its tenants unaware that beneath their office floors lay the foundations of what was once America's most spectacular private residence. Other lost mansions met more personal fates. The Schwab Mansion, despite its overwhelming beauty, never found a buyer after Schwab's financial decline. Neighbors complained of its looming presence. Developers saw only the acreage, not the artistry. The mansion was left vacant, slowly decaying until demolition crews arrived. One of the greatest architectural masterpieces of its era was reduced to rubble in mere weeks, an ending so abrupt that newspapers compared it to the destruction of European palaces during wartime. The Louis Comfort Tiffany Mansion suffered its own tragic demise. Though Tiffany was one of America's most celebrated artists, the house became a financial burden after his death. With the family unable to support its upkeep and no institution willing to preserve it, the mansion was torn down in 1936. What could not be destroyed, however, was the public's outrage. Citizens who had worshipped Tiffany's craftsmanship were horrified that New York would allow such a treasure to vanish. This anger joined a growing chorus of frustration after the demolition of other significant buildings, ultimately culminating in the creation of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965. It took the loss of greatness to teach the city what was worth saving. But nowhere was this lesson more painfully learned than with the destruction of the original Pennsylvania station. When the first report surfaced that the station would be demolished, the nation reacted with disbelief. Penn Station was not merely a transit hub. It was a civic space modeled on the baths of Caracalla, with 150-foot vaulted ceilings, Doric colonnades, bronze doors, and vast skylights. It had been a temple to human movement, a place where ordinary commuters temporarily became monarchs, walking beneath stone meant to outlast the centuries. Yet the Pennsylvania Railroad, financially crippled, viewed the structure not as a cultural treasure, but as an expense. Madison Square Garden was built above the station's remains, entombing what had once been considered one of the most beautiful buildings in America. Photographs of its destruction, giant stone eagles lifted away by cranes, iron beams sliced apart like wounded limbs, became symbols of civic betrayal. From this moment, New York changed. The city realized that progress without preservation was not progress at all. It was amnesia. Far from Manhattan, the Gold Coast mansions met their own slow decline. As maintenance costs soared and the Great Depression ravaged the country, many owners abandoned their estates or sold them for fractions of their original prices. Beacon Towers, the fairy tale fortress that inspired Gatsby's mansion, was allowed to crumble before being demolished in the 1940s. Land's End followed decades later. Harbor Hill, once the setting of the most extravagant parties in American history, stood abandoned for years before finally being razed in the 1940s. Yet one mansion survived, Oheka Castle. Built by Otto Kahn, it remains one of the few Gilded Age estates to be restored. Its survival proves that preservation is not only possible, but deeply valuable. Oheka stands today as a rare window into the lost world of gilded extravagance, its hallways echoing with the ghost of parties that once defined Long Island society. As we examine these lost mansions, a broader truth emerges. These structures were not merely casualties of changing architecture. They were casualties of changing values. The Gilded Age elite built homes meant to immortalize themselves, but they did so in a culture that valued innovation over heritage, expansion over memory, and profit over permanence. In a city defined by motion, the quiet grandeur of these mansions could not compete. Still, the city remembers them, not in stone, but in spirit. Their disappearance sparked preservation laws, inspired films like The Great Gatsby, and shaped the architectural conscience of a nation that had nearly destroyed its own past. And so we return to the question that haunts every corner of this documentary. What does it mean for a city to lose its monuments? What is sacrificed when marble gives way to glass, when art gives way to efficiency, when stories are buried under concrete? The answers are complex, but one truth is clear. The lost mansions of Gilded Age New York are more than relics. They are warnings written across time, reminders that even the greatest achievements can vanish if a society fails to value them. Their disappearance also forces us to confront another reality. These mansions were never only about architecture, they were about narrative. Every stone facade, every carved balustrade, every gilded ceiling was a story about ambition, about self-construction, about the American dream twisted into something larger than life. When these homes fell, it wasn't merely the loss of buildings, it was the collapse of carefully crafted identities. The Gilded Age elite built with the conviction that their legacies were indestructible. New York proved otherwise. To walk the streets where these mansions once stood is to feel a kind of architectural phantom pain, a sense that the city remembers what it has lost, even when the physical markers have vanished. On Riverside Drive, the land where Charles Schwab's mansion reigned, now hosts an unremarkable apartment complex, its brick walls giving no hint that a personal Versailles once dominated the skyline. Longtime residents admit that most people living there today have no idea they occupy ground that once dazzled visiting royalty and industrial titans. Fifth Avenue tells a similar story. Where the Vanderbilt Triple Palace stretched across an entire block, shoppers now browse luxury goods beneath fluorescent lights, unaware that the very idea of Fifth Avenue prestige was built, literally, on the ashes of the Vanderbilt legacy. On weekends, tourists snap photographs outside Tiffany & Co., never realizing that Louis Comfort Tiffany's own mansion, arguably one of the greatest artistic homes in American history, was demolished just a few blocks away. This forgetting is not accidental. New York renews itself through forgetting. The city's power lies in its ability to shed its skin, to reinvent its identity, and to bury the past beneath towering ambitions. But even as steel and glass skyscrapers climb into the clouds, the echoes of lost grandeur remain embedded in the foundations. Take the lost world of Long Island's Gold Coast, once home to more than 600 gilded estates, each a self-contained universe of wealth. Today, fewer than a handful survive. Driving through the quiet suburban neighborhoods that have replaced them, it is almost impossible to imagine that these were once landscapes of staggering theatricality, where fountains soared into the sky and marble staircases descended toward private shorelines. Residents now mow lawns, where Golden Age millionaires once orchestrated fireworks displays, and children play frisbee on grounds where international dignitaries once arrived in chauffeured cars. Yet perhaps the most compelling part of this story is not the rise or even the destruction of these mansions, but what their absence reveals about the nature of American wealth. The Gilded Age elite believed that architecture could solidify their power, that stone and marble could freeze their legacies in time. But the very forces that made them rich, innovation, competition, expansion, urbanization, were the same forces that ensured their homes would not endure. Their mansions were built on foundations of economic volatility. Industry shifted, fortunes crumbled, heirs splintered their inheritances, taxes skyrocketed, land values soared. And as modernity marched forward, these palaces, once the symbols of progress, became symbols of outdated excess. This was not merely the end of buildings, it was the end of an era. The demolition of Penn Station crystallized this change in the nation's consciousness. When its stone eagles were lifted away by cranes and its iron arches were sliced into scrap, the public finally recognized that America had been destroying its own architectural heritage for decades. The earlier losses, the Schwab Mansion, the Vanderbilt estates, the Tiffany Mansion, suddenly became part of a larger pattern, a warning that without intervention, the nation's iconic structures would continue to disappear. Photographs taken during the demolition resemble scenes from a battlefield. Dust clouds fill the air where the waiting room once soared 150 feet above commuters' heads. Men in hard hats walk across shattered marble floors that once reverberated with the footfalls of millions. Journalists wrote that the destruction felt like watching a civilization willingly tear down its own cathedral. And in a very real sense, it was. The public outcry led to hearings, protests, and ultimately, action. Preservationists argued that beauty was not a luxury, but a public right, that architecture should serve not only utility, but identity. Their efforts resulted in the birth of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, a turning point in American civic consciousness. Because Penn Station fell, Grand Central Terminal did not. Because earlier mansions vanished, later masterpieces were saved. The story of New York's lost mansions is therefore not only a tragedy, it is a catalyst. Still, the losses remain immense. Consider the Tiffany Mansion, an architectural jewel filled with stained glass panels that radiated like gemstones, with mosaics shimmering under a cascade of colored sunlight. Guests described walking through the home as stepping into an artwork. And yet, in 1936, financial pressure and dwindling institutional interest sealed its fate. While some architectural fragments were salvaged, the house itself vanished. Today, the site bears no hint of Tiffany's brilliance, its memory surviving only in photographs and in the movement it helped inspire. The Schwab Mansion faced a similarly heart-wrenching fate. Designed as a flamboyant tribute to French Renaissance palaces, it boasted a staircase modeled on the Château de Blois, ceilings carved with allegorical scenes, and a music hall that could rival European theaters. Even those who disliked Schwab's reputation conceded that the home was a masterpiece. But the city's appetite for apartment buildings rendered the mansion obsolete. Demolition crews began their work, and the mansion, once the epitome of industrial triumph, became rubble hauled away by trucks. For many observers, it felt like losing a piece of New York's soul. On Long Island, the disappearance of Beacon Towers, Harbor Hill, and Land's End represented the crumbling of a different kind of dream, a dream born from the leisure culture of America's wealthy. These were not merely homes, they were estates designed for the performance of decadence. Tennis courts lit for midnight play, theaters hidden behind velvet curtains, dining rooms large enough to hold armies of servants. F. Scott Fitzgerald saw these places firsthand, transforming them into literary mythology. When they were demolished, the last surviving physical traces of Gatsby's world disappeared. The irony is unmistakable. The mansions that inspired The Great Gatsby, a novel about the illusion of permanence and the destruction of dreams, ultimately met the same fate as their fictional counterparts. And yet, in the grand tapestry of New York's evolution, their disappearance continues to shape the city's identity. The loss of these mansions forced New Yorkers to confront the value of beauty in a city obsessed with utility. It sparked debates about heritage, space, culture, and what future generations deserve to inherit. Perhaps most importantly, it reminded us that architecture is more than shelter. It is a vessel for memory. When a mansion falls, we lose not just a building, but a worldview, a belief system carved into stone. In the absence of these, vanished palaces, New York's architectural landscape now tells a story of substitution. A city where modest brick structures and soaring glass towers have replaced the ornate silhouettes that once defined entire neighborhoods. Yet, beneath the rhythm of present-day traffic and the relentless vertical march of construction, the ghosts of the Gilded Age remain embedded in the grid itself. You can trace them through the sudden widenings of certain streets, the irregular angles where estates once intruded upon the city plan, and the inexplicable gaps in otherwise consistent rows of high-rises. The city's blueprint still carries the faint fingerprints of its lost royalty. But the most intriguing legacy of these vanished mansions is not physical, it is psychological. Their destruction coincided with a shift in American attitudes about wealth. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, opulence was aspirational. Wealth was something to be displayed, amplified, expressed through architecture on a monumental scale. Marble staircases were not excessive, they were statements. Gilded ceilings were not frivolous, they were symbols of national progress. The American elite saw their homes as civic contributions, visual proof that the nation could rival the aristocracies of Europe. Yet, by the mid-20th century, those same displays became liabilities. The same mansions that once represented success now seemed like burdens, massive, outdated, too expensive to maintain, too large for modern urban families. The cultural appetite shifted from ostentation to efficiency. The Gilded Age aesthetic, once celebrated, became a relic of a bygone era, a reminder of inequality in a nation increasingly obsessed with democratization and social mobility. This shift was not merely stylistic, it reflected deeper societal changes. The United States was reorienting itself toward modernism, toward sleek lines and functionalism, toward a belief that the future lay not in ornament, but in innovation. The emotional distance between Fifth Avenue in 1900 and Fifth Avenue in 1950 was not measured in architecture alone, but in ideology. And yet, paradoxically, the destruction of these mansions only increased their mystique. Today, people seek out the stories of these lost estates with greater fascination than ever. Documentaries, books, archived photographs, and speculative reconstructions attempt to resurrect the vanished grandeur. Historians pore over floor plans, preservationists hunt for surviving fragments, and digital artists recreate lost rooms in three-dimensional renderings. What was once dismissed as outdated excess has become an object of cultural longing. In part, this resurgence stems from a recognition that the Gilded Age was more than a period of wealth. It was a chapter in America's artistic and technological awakening. The artisans who crafted these mansions were among the finest in the world. They carved marble by hand, inlaid floors with international timber, embroidered silk wallpaper, sculpted bronze balustrades, and forged iron gates with a craftsmanship rarely seen today. Losing these buildings meant losing the work of thousands of artisans whose labor was largely undocumented and unpreserved. Their skills, passed down through centuries of European tradition, were absorbed into New York's skyline and then erased. In their wake, the city was left not only architecturally diminished, but culturally impoverished. Consider the Vanderbilt Triple Palace, once a sprawling fortress of wealth, art, and ambition. Boasting more than 100 rooms, embellished with frescoes, carved oak, and priceless antiques, it stood as a monument to a family whose name dominated American industry. The demolition of that building marked the symbolic end of the Vanderbilt dynasty's architectural presence in New York. In the rubble of its marble halls, one could read the collapse of generational power, a dynasty reduced not by war or disaster, but by time, taste, and taxation. The Schwab Mansion tells a different but equally poignant story. It exemplified the rise, and dramatic fall, of a self-made industrialist. Charles Schwab, once celebrated as a steel titan, saw his empire and fortune evaporate. His mansion, built as a defiant expression of his success, became a reminder of how quickly fortunes could reverse. Ultimately, no museum sought to save it. No government agency intervened. When the wrecking ball arrived, the public's reaction was muted. Its destruction was accepted as an inevitable consequence of modernity. The Tiffany Mansion's demise, however, was a watershed moment. People expected mansions tied to industrialists or railroad magnates to fall. But Tiffany was an artist, one of the most celebrated of the era. His home was not just a palace, it was a masterpiece of American design, a living exhibition of stained glass, mosaic tilework, and decorative art. When it was torn down, it felt less like the loss of a home and more like the erasure of a cultural institution. For many New Yorkers, it was the first time the demolition of a private residence sparked genuine public grief. This grief foreshadowed the reaction to Penn Station. When the old station came down, the city reached a breaking point. New Yorkers realized that if even Penn Station, a public monument, a civic cathedral, could be destroyed, then nothing was safe. Outrage spread across newspapers, universities, architectural circles, and cultural societies. The destruction of Penn Station was the moment when the collective memory of the city became activated. People suddenly understood the cumulative loss of decades of architectural erasure. In this sense, the lost mansions prepared the public for the fight to save what remained. But the legacy of these missing palaces also lives on through the infrastructure they inspired. After the demolition of the Triple Palace and other Fifth Avenue mansions, the Landmarks Preservation Commission began, protecting surviving masterpieces like the Frick Collection, the Cooper Hewitt Mansion, the Morgan Library, and the Ukrainian Institute. These buildings, once private symbols of wealth, became public treasures. Their survival represents a shift in American cultural values, a belief that beauty should be shared, not hoarded. Perhaps the most surprising legacy of the lost mansions is their influence on today's real estate market. Modern luxury towers now attempt to recreate, in abstract form, the grandeur of the Gilded Age. Developers promise palatial penthouses, triple-height great rooms, and European craftsmanship, echoing the vocabulary of the vanished estates. Glass replaces marble, steel replaces carved oak, skyline views replace private gardens. Yet the psychological appeal remains the same, a home not merely as shelter, but as a personal monument. Still, nothing quite replicates the visceral impact of the originals. The Gilded Age mansions were not simply large, they were dramatic. They dominated the landscape with unapologetic confidence. Their builders wanted to be seen, remembered, admired. Today's luxury construction may be ambitious, but it rarely seeks to astonish in the way these mansions once did. And so, the lost mansions linger in the cultural imagination, not just because they were beautiful, but because they were bold. They were expressions of a uniquely American audacity, the belief that one could build a personal kingdom in the heart of the nation's most dynamic city, reshape the skyline, and leave behind something eternal. But eternity, as history proved, is fragile. The truth, however, is that New York has always been a city that renegotiates its identity with each passing generation. The skyline is not fixed. It is a living organism, constantly reshaped by shifting economies, evolving tastes, and the ambitions of those bold enough to build within it. And nowhere is this evolutionary pattern more visible than in the story of the Gilded Age mansions, which rose with thunderous confidence only to vanish in near silence. To understand why these mansions disappeared, one must examine the larger forces at play, forces far larger than any individual estate or wealthy family. One such force was urban density. As the 20th century progressed, Manhattan became increasingly crowded. Land grew scarce. Space became a luxury in itself. Towering apartment buildings and office complexes promised more revenue per square foot than any single-family palace ever could. In this competitive landscape, the mansions, no matter how grand, were simply not financially viable. What was once a symbol of prestige became an economic liability. City planners and developers no longer saw Fifth Avenue as a boulevard of private wealth. They saw it as the future commercial artery of New York City. Retailers wanted flagship stores, corporations wanted headquarters, hotels wanted prime real estate. The mansions, clinging to their sprawling footprints, became obstacles to growth. And so, piece by piece, the palaces began to fall. The most shocking part is how little resistance there initially was. In the early 20th century, New Yorkers accepted demolition as a natural part of progress. The city was industrial, practical, forward-looking. Preservation was a luxury few considered. The idea of saving a private mansion simply because it was beautiful was not yet a widely held value. But this attitude would begin to shift, slowly, then suddenly. As the city matured, a cultural nostalgia crept in. People began to ask, what are we losing when we tear down the past? This question intensified each time a beloved building disappeared, but it reached its emotional apex with the destruction of Penn Station. The demolition triggered a reckoning, not only among architects and historians, but among ordinary New Yorkers who felt, perhaps for the first time, that their heritage had been violated. In retrospect, the lost Gilded Age mansions became the quiet prelude to a cultural awakening. Today, these vanished palaces form a ghost map of New York, a map that reveals how the city once understood power, taste, and identity. For example, if one were to walk up Fifth Avenue from 34th Street to 97th, they would traverse the former sites of dozens of long-lost estates: the Astors, the Carnegies, the Goulds, the Rockefellers, the Belmonts, the Vanderbilts. Only a handful remain. What does it say about a city when even its wealthiest residents could not secure permanence? It reveals that in New York, status is fleeting, control is temporary, and the only constant is change. Yet, another truth emerges when studying these vanished estates. Though the buildings are gone, their influence remains. The very idea of Fifth Avenue as a luxury destination, now synonymous with global retail and corporate prestige, originated with the Gilded Age mansions that once lined its length. These estates embedded the avenue with a sense of exclusivity that commercial enterprises later capitalized on. Even today, when someone purchases an ultra-luxury penthouse overlooking Central Park or spends a small fortune on a Fifth Avenue storefront, they are participating in a legacy first carved out by these long-lost titans of industry. New York's identity as a capital of aspiration, architectural, financial, cultural, was built on the foundations of these homes. But if the city inherited their spirit, it also inherited their cautionary tales. The Schwab Mansion warns us about the volatility of fortune, how wealth gained quickly can disappear just as fast. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace warns us about the fragility of dynasties, how even the richest families can fail to sustain their legacies without foresight. The Tiffany Mansion warns us about the undervaluing of artistic heritage, how cultural treasures are often recognized only after they are gone. Beacon Towers, Harbor Hill, and Land's End warn us about the impermanence of excess, how grandeur without stewardship is destined to fade. And Penn Station warns us that the modern world can destroy its greatest accomplishments in the name of efficiency if vigilance is not maintained. But perhaps the most haunting lesson of all lies in the way New York remembers these places, because despite their destruction, they continue to occupy an enormous amount of cultural space. Books, documentaries, museum exhibits, historical societies, architectural tours, and digital recreations now work endlessly to keep their memory alive. Though the mansions themselves have vanished, their stories refuse to die. In many ways, they have transcended physical existence. By becoming subjects of fascination, they have achieved a kind of immortality that even their builders might not have anticipated. The Gilded Age mansions have become myths, modern American legends about ambition, opulence, and transformation. Even more fascinating is the way these stories resonate with contemporary audiences. In a world where wealth inequality is once again a topic of national conversation, where billionaire estates attract public scrutiny, and where the idea of legacy has regained cultural relevance, the fallen mansions offer a symbolic mirror to the present. They show us what happens when wealth is used to impress, intimidate, and elevate, but not necessarily to endure. They show us how architecture can embody an era's values, anxieties, and aspirations. They show us how societies reinvent themselves by destroying their own monuments. And they invite us to imagine a different kind of legacy, one where beauty, craftsmanship, and cultural heritage are valued as deeply as innovation and profit. Yet one question lingers, hovering over the entire narrative like a ghost. If these mansions still stood today, would we appreciate them more? Most preservationists believe the answer is yes. In an age where craftsmanship of such quality is rare and costly, the lost mansions would be treated as national treasures. They would attract millions of visitors, serve as museums, host exhibitions, and anchor entire districts. They would be celebrated in films, restored through philanthropy, and protected through legislation. But history cannot be unwritten. New York is a city that moves forward, even when it leaves beauty behind. And yet, even as we mourn the mansions that no longer stand, one must acknowledge that their destruction contributed to the forging of a new identity for the city, one rooted not in aristocratic permanence, but in perpetual reinvention. New York became the world's most recognizable metropolis, not through preservation alone, but through the relentless, almost mythic turnover of architecture, culture, industry, and imagination. Still, the erasure of these estates left behind a void, an absence felt most deeply by those who study the city's cultural evolution. For historians and architects, the vanished mansions form an invisible constellation of influence that continues to shape the way we interpret New York's aesthetic transformation. They were not mere buildings, they were early experiments in American identity making. Their architects, artisans, and owners all sought to define a distinctly American version of luxury, independent from the aristocratic traditions of Europe. The result was a fusion of styles that came to symbolize the ambitions of a young, booming nation: Beaux-Arts, Renaissance revival, Chateauesque, Gothic revival, and even Moorish influences intertwined in ways that had rarely been attempted elsewhere. These mansions were architectural laboratories, bold, audacious, sometimes excessive, always extraordinary. And through their rise and fall, they left behind guiding principles for the development of modern American architecture. Charles Schwab's mansion, for instance, represented the industrialist's dream of self-determined grandeur. Its elaborate interiors, inlaid with mahogany, marble, and tapestries sourced from global artisans, embodied Schwab's meteoric ascent from steel plant laborer to steel empire magnate. It was a physical autobiography, etched in stone and wood. But the mansion's demolition revealed something more profound. Personal wealth is no guarantee of architectural immortality. When Schwab's fortune collapsed, so too did the material expression of his legacy. Similarly, the Vanderbilt Triple Palace stood as a proclamation of dynastic power. Constructed at a time when the Vanderbilt family reigned supreme over American railroads and American society, it symbolized a dynasty confident in its permanence. Yet its destruction illustrated the volatility of generational wealth. The Triple Palace was consumed not by neglect, but by the unstoppable force of urban densification. Fifth Avenue had become too valuable, too commercially vibrant for a single family residence, no matter how grand, to justify its existence. Louis Comfort Tiffany's mansion, on the other hand, offers a different lesson. Its loss was cultural, not merely economic. Here was a home built by a man who elevated American decorative arts to international prominence. The mansion was an extension of his artistic soul, filled with stained glass masterpieces, mosaics shimmering with iridescent color, and rooms designed as immersive aesthetic experiences. Demolishing such a house was a wound to the country's artistic heritage, but the outcry that followed helped ignite the preservationist spirit that later saved landmarks across the city. These individual stories intersect most dramatically in the case of Penn Station. The station was not a private home, but a public monument, built on the same principles of grandeur and permanence that defined the Gilded Age. Its demolition, a scar on the civic psyche, finally awakened the public's awareness of what had been lost. What the destruction of the mansions began, the demolition of Penn Station completed, it birthed a movement. But to understand the cultural afterlife of these vanished estates, one must look not only at their architectural legacy, but also at the psychological imprint they have left upon American imagination. Some places, even when erased, refuse to disappear. The Gilded Age mansions continue to occupy space in literature, cinema, historical narratives, and collective memory. Modern films that depict early 20th century wealth often draw visual inspiration from these long-lost palaces. The mansion's ghostly presence also lingers in contemporary media, from documentaries to digital reconstructions, keeping their stories alive for audiences who never saw them firsthand. The fascination extends further. Enthusiasts dedicate countless hours to studying archival photographs, floor plans, and drawings in an effort to reconstruct these estates virtually. Digital artists have rebuilt entire mansions in 3 dimensions, breathing life back into rooms that vanished decades before anyone alive today was born. The internet, in an ironic twist, has allowed these lost mansions to reach far more people in the 21st century than they ever did when they physically existed. This enduring interest suggests something deeper. These mansions embody a longing for craftsmanship, beauty, and architectural individuality that has largely faded in an era dominated by minimalism and efficiency-driven design. Their disappearance has made them even more alluring, like rare artifacts from a lost civilization. Even the land where they once stood possesses a strange magnetism. Real estate listings for apartments located on former mansion estates often highlight their history, as if the past itself adds value. People want proximity to grandeur, even if the grandeur has crumbled to dust. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of this legacy is how the story of the lost mansions parallels the broader American story, a tale of ambition, reinvention, triumph, decline, destruction, and resurgence. Each mansion's rise reflects the explosive growth of American industry. Each mansion's glory reflects the optimism and hubris of its age. Each mansion's fall reflects the evolution of cultural values. And each mansion's memory reflects the human desire to preserve meaning even in the face of change. In this sense, the lost mansions of Gilded Age New York are not merely architectural casualties, but cultural symbols. They tell us who we once were and who we believed ourselves to be. They show the tension between personal wealth and public identity. They reveal the fragility of even the most powerful legacies. They expose the speed with which a city can rewrite itself. And they remind us that beauty, no matter how monumental, is vulnerable without collective stewardship. Today, the few surviving Gilded Age mansions, such as the Frick Collection, the Ukrainian Institute, the Cooper Hewitt Museum, and the Carnegie Mansion, stand as living testaments to what was lost. They have become guardians of a vanished era, offering rare opportunities to step inside a world that once dominated the landscape but now survives only in fragments. Visitors marvel at their sweeping staircases, gilded ceilings, and hushed libraries, often unaware that dozens of similar masterpieces once stood throughout the city. These survivors function as architectural ambassadors, reminding us of the richness of a bygone New York and the devastating cost of its disappearance. But the question remains, what would New York look like today if these mansions had endured? Would Fifth Avenue be a museum corridor lined with palaces? Would Riverside Drive rival the boulevards of Paris? Would the Gold Coast of Long Island be an American Versailles? The answers, while unknowable, illuminate the core of the story. New York is both enriched and haunted by what it has lost. To imagine an alternate New York, one in which these mansions survived, is to imagine a city with a radically different relationship to beauty. A city where public life unfolds not only among glass towers and neon storefronts, but also among carved stone balconies, terraced gardens, and facades that tell stories in sculpted reliefs. A city whose avenues might feel more like the boulevards of Vienna or the grand quays of Paris, where each building seems to converse with the next, weaving a narrative continuity across entire neighborhoods. Instead, Modern New York is characterized by contrast. Glass abuts brick, steel shadows brownstone. Skyscrapers rise beside structures barely 2 stories tall. The city's architectural collage is vibrant but jagged, and the smooth visual rhythm that once defined whole stretches of Fifth Avenue has been replaced by a chaotic mosaic of styles and eras. And yet, this very contrast adds to New York's legendary dynamism. The lost mansions are a key part of this interplay. Their absence is palpable, but their influence is embedded everywhere, in zoning laws, in preservation battles, in museum collections, and even in the design of luxury towers that attempt, however faintly, to echo their grandeur. In truth, the Gilded Age mansions established the psychological baseline for luxury in New York. No matter how tall contemporary skyscrapers climb, or how technologically advanced they become, they are still compared against the memory of those early palaces, whose craftsmanship remains unsurpassed. The bespoke woodwork, the hand-laid mosaics, the frescoed ceilings, the enchanted stained glass. These were not amenities, but statements of identity. The mansions represented the belief that a home should not simply shelter life, but elevate it. As those values faded, replaced by modernism's emphasis on efficiency, the city underwent a philosophical shift. Practicality superseded ornamentation. Function trumped form. And yet, as decades passed, a cultural hunger for lost beauty began to grow. This hunger is perhaps most visible in the revival, attempts that surfaced in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Developers started using terms like neoclassical, heritage-inspired, and timeless elegance to market new residential towers. High-end apartments were advertised with hand-carved moldings, imported marbles, and old-world finishes. Architects borrowed vocabulary from Gilded Age designers, hoping to reignite the allure of grandeur. But despite these efforts, no modern development has recreated the all-encompassing theatricality of the original estates. Their magic lay in the total experience. The driveways lined with lanterns, the operatic foyers, the carved stone balustrades, the hidden solariums, the frescoed conservatories, the private gardens that cascaded toward the Hudson or the Long Island Sound. These were not mere houses, they were immersive environments. To lose them was to lose not only architecture, but also an entire way of imagining what a home could be. Yet the story is not merely nostalgic, it is also deeply instructive. For when we examine the forces that led to the destruction of these mansions, we gain insight into the social, economic, and political transformations that defined 20th century America. These estates fell not because they were unloved, but because they were unsustainable in a rapidly modernizing world. The rise of progressive taxation made large estates financially burdensome. Antitrust laws broke apart the corporate giants that had funded their construction. Economic crises, from the Panic of 1907 to the Great Depression, eroded fortunes. Urbanization reoriented land values. Succeeding generations chose smaller homes, simpler lifestyles, or entirely different priorities. In many cases, heirs lacked either the desire or the means to maintain the estates. In others, developers offered irresistible sums for land that could support high-density buildings. After World War II, modernists saw these mansions as symbols of inequality and decadence, cultural relics that stood in the way of progress. By the time the preservation movement fully emerged, the casualties were already vast. But the story takes a fascinating turn here. Even though the mansions were destroyed, they profoundly influenced the creation of the preservation laws that now protect New York's remaining landmarks. Their absence gave rise to a new public consciousness, one that recognized beauty as a civic asset rather than a private indulgence. This shift fundamentally altered the city's development trajectory. Without it, Grand Central Terminal might have been demolished. So too might the New York Public Library, the Dakota, or even the Empire State Building during mid-century redevelopment debates. The ghosts of the lost mansions became silent advocates for the protection of architectural heritage. Their destruction taught the city how to save itself. And so, the lost mansions occupy a unique cultural space. They are simultaneously symbols of excess and guardians of artistic memory. Their stories remind us of the heights of American ambition, the volatility of fortune, and the evolving definition of legacy. But perhaps the most compelling truth is this: New York's lost mansions did not disappear quietly. They left behind clues, architectural breadcrumbs scattered throughout the modern city. Some appear in the form of salvaged interiors, rescued from demolition and installed in museums or repurposed in other buildings. For example, wood paneling from the Schwab Mansion can be found in churches. Marble fireplaces from demolished Fifth Avenue estates grace private collections. Fragments of Tiffany's mosaics are preserved in museum archives. Other traces exist in the topography itself. Look closely at the slight curves in Riverside Drive, and you will see the ghost outlines of the palaces that once claimed those parcels of land. Walk through the Upper East Side, and certain unusually deep setbacks hint at vanished courtyards and carriage entrances. Study early city maps, and you will encounter forgotten names, residences so vast they required their own street alignments. Even the airspace above Penn Station still carries the weight of its absence. Commuters feel it daily without realizing it, the sense that something is missing, that the cramped underground corridors cannot possibly represent the true spirit of a gateway city. It is a void created not by neglect, but by replacement. Where a cathedral once stood, a bunker remains. In this way, the lost mansions exist not as ruins, but as impressions, architectural memories etched into the psyche of the city. They endure in the collective imagination because they represent something New York has always grappled with: the tension between reinvention and remembrance. Should a city cling to its past, or should it relentlessly pursue its future? Should beauty be preserved, or should practicality prevail? Should grandeur be cherished, or is it an outdated relic? These questions remain unresolved, and perhaps they are unresolvable. New York thrives precisely because it balances on the edge of these contradictions. But the lost mansions of the Gilded Age have given the city something invaluable: perspective. They remind us that progress is not without cost. They remind us that beauty, once lost, is impossible to fully reclaim. And they remind us that the architecture we choose to destroy says as much about us as the architecture we choose to build. Yet, despite all that has been lost, the memory of these vanished estates continues to deepen, evolve, and influence how New Yorkers, and Americans, understand their architectural heritage. As more people rediscover the history of the Gilded Age, the mansions have undergone a kind of cultural resurrection. Their stories echo through museum exhibitions, historical archives, walking tours, academic studies, and even social media accounts dedicated to lost New York. In a strange and fascinating twist, digital technology has allowed these mansions to be more visible now than they were in their own lifetimes. High-resolution scans of century-old photographs reveal details once unnoticed: the grain of carved oak, the delicate brushstrokes of frescoed ceilings, the shimmering tesserae of Tiffany mosaics. Virtual reconstructions offer fully navigable versions of demolished interiors. Architectural historians collaborate with 3D artists to rebuild entire estates, room by room, based on surviving floor plans, letters, and photographic evidence. The result is astonishing: a rebirth of spaces once consigned to rubble. The public response to these digital reconstructions reveals something profound. People are captivated not only by the beauty of the architecture, but also by the tragedy of its loss. In the absence of physical structures, narrative becomes the architecture. The story becomes the monument. and as a result, the mansions have transformed from symbols of wealth to symbols of historical longing. This longing is not simply aesthetic, it is emotional. The Gilded Age estates represented a belief that beauty should be monumental, that craftsmanship mattered, that architecture could be an expression of national pride. Even those who critique the excesses of the era acknowledge the artistry involved. Behind every carved frieze, every paneled library, every iron balustrade was a team of master artisans whose skills are nearly lost today. Their absence leaves a void, not because we wish to return to the inequalities of the age, but because we yearn for the artistry it produced. To walk into a surviving Gilded Age mansion today is to confront something rare, evidence of human hands shaping materials with painstaking intention. The wood is warm, the marble soft to the touch, the stained glass shimmering with a depth of color impossible to reproduce with modern manufacturing. These qualities create not just admiration, but intimacy, a sense of connection to history that glass skyscrapers, for all their grandeur, cannot replicate. And so, as we consider the loss of these mansions, we are faced with an uncomfortable truth. The destruction was not merely architectural, but cultural. It represented the erasure of a level of craftsmanship that can no longer be mass-produced, no matter how advanced our technology becomes. This is perhaps most felt in the interiors of homes like the Schwab Mansion. Photos show sweeping staircases carved with Renaissance precision, drawing rooms paneled in mahogany that had aged for centuries before being harvested, and ceilings adorned with hand-painted allegories. These were not decorative choices. They were declarations of identity. Schwab wanted his mansion to read as a biography carved into stone and wood. Its demolition erased not only a home, but a worldview. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace tells a similar story on a much grander scale. Its sheer size challenged the conventions of what a private residence could be. The mansion's ballroom, so vast that it consumed an entire city block, stood as the ultimate symbol of the family's social ambitions. Its destruction represented the final unraveling of the Vanderbilt Empire's grip on New York society. Today, the idea of a family building a private palace on Fifth Avenue seems unimaginable. But that impossibility highlights just how dramatically the city has changed. The idea of space itself has transformed. What was once a symbol of wealth is now seen as an unsustainable indulgence. Louis Comfort Tiffany's mansion, meanwhile, stands as the most heartbreaking loss for many historians. The house was more than a residence. It was a living museum of Tiffany's artistic philosophy. Every room showcased experimentation, stained glass that bent light in new ways, metalwork that blended Art Nouveau with American motifs, mosaics that fused Byzantine influences with Tiffany's own iridescent style. To lose such a home was to lose one of the most important artistic environments in American history. When it was demolished in 1936, the outcry was small compared to the Penn Station protests that came decades later. But the Tiffany Mansion's destruction planted seeds of concern among architects and artists. It reminded them that New York's constant reinvention carried consequences, and that beauty could be lost if the public did not recognize its value. The Long Island Gold Coast mansions reveal another dimension of this narrative, the collision of fantasy and reality. Estates like Beacon Towers, Harbor Hill, Land's End, and Oheka Castle were architectural manifestations of dreams of European aristocracy transplanted into American soil. Their sprawling acreage, elaborate gardens, and theatrical facades were stages for the performance of wealth. But when the fortunes that sustained them evaporated, their fragility became painfully clear. They were too large, too expensive, too unwieldy for a modern world shaped by income taxes, suburbanization, and shifting cultural priorities. Their demolition created not just physical gaps in the landscape, but emotional gaps in the American imagination. their specter endures most famously through The Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald's masterpiece immortalized the Gold Coast mansions as symbols of aspiration, illusion, and inevitable collapse. When the real mansions fell, they validated the very themes he had written about. Their demise completed the metaphor. Meanwhile, Penn Station's destruction stands as the pivotal moment when New Yorkers realize the cost of unchecked development. Photos from the demolition show the station's once majestic iron canopy hanging like skeletal ribs above mountains of rubble. Commuters walked past without looking up, accustomed already to the loss. But photographers captured the tragedy, and their images circulated widely, provoking outrage and eventually reform. It was only after losing something irreplaceable that the public understood what preservation truly meant. Because preservation is not just about saving architecture, it is about saving identity. New York's identity is shaped by its skyline, its streetscape, its landmarks, its ghosts. Without a sense of continuity, the city becomes unanchored, a place where memory dissolves in the face of relentless change. The preservation movement that followed Penn Station's demolition was an attempt to reclaim that continuity. It succeeded, but only partially. Thousands of buildings were already gone. And so, the lost mansions occupy a strange middle place in New York's story. Absent, but omnipresent, demolished, but never forgotten, erased, yet continually rediscovered. The city that replaced them is dazzling in its own right. But beneath its shimmering modernity lies a buried world of marble halls, carved staircases, Tiffany windows, and fresco-lit ballrooms, a world that still breathes in the collective memory of the city. To truly understand the emotional weight these lost mansions carry today, one must consider the generation who witnessed their demolition firsthand. For them, it was not merely a matter of architecture, it was the disintegration of a familiar world. Elderly New Yorkers in the mid-20th century remembered the grand avenues of their youth, lined with palaces that felt as permanent as mountains. They watched as bulldozers moved through neighborhoods like an invading army, dismantling the physical landscape of their memories. Letters published in newspapers during the 1950s and 60s convey a mixture of sorrow, disbelief, and resignation. One resident wrote that the demolition of the Vanderbilt mansions felt like watching a museum being torn down to build a warehouse. Another lamented, "Our city is losing its poetry." These sentiments reveal something crucial. The mansions were more than stone. They were emotional anchors for generations. And yet, for many younger New Yorkers at the time, the demolitions hardly registered as tragedies. A new world was emerging, one of modernist aspirations, skyscrapers of glass and aluminum, and urban efficiency. A world where progress required sacrifice. Preservationists at that time were dismissed by critics as nostalgics, dreamers, or obstacles to growth. It took the enormous shock of Penn Station's destruction to awaken a universal understanding of what had been lost. This generational divide underscores a broader tension in New York's identity. The city is both guardian and destroyer of its own history. But while the physical structures vanished, the cultural residue of the Gilded Age remained strong. In fact, the absence of these mansions has boosted the mystique of the era. Historians argue that if the Schwab Mansion or the Triple Palace had survived intact, they might have become museum pieces, still stunning, but limited in their imaginative power. Instead, their destruction transformed them into myths. The mansions now belong not only to the past, but to the realm of American legend. This transformation, from architecture to mythology, is clearest in the case of Long Island's Gold Coast. Take Beacon Towers, for example. While it stood, it was regarded as an eccentric, even bizarre palace, its Gothic turrets rising like a storybook castle against the Long Island Sound. Only after its demolition did it become universally revered as the tangible inspiration for Gatsby's mansion. Its absence enhanced its influence. The less accessible its memory became, the more powerful its symbolism grew. Or consider Harbor Hill, once one of the largest private residences in the United States. At the time of its construction, newspapers described it as outrageous in scale, a monument to the audacity of American wealth. Yet when it was destroyed, people suddenly recognized it as an architectural masterpiece. Its gardens, its marble staircases, its domed atrium, features once critiqued as excessive, became sources of nostalgia. The same phenomenon surrounds the Tiffany Mansion. During Tiffany's lifetime, the home was admired but not universally adored. Some critics found it too flamboyant, too eccentric. Yet, once it was demolished, its reputation soared. Today, scholars consider it one of the most significant expressions of American decorative arts ever built. Its loss is viewed as a cultural wound, an example of how short-sighted modernization erased something irreplaceable. Even the Schwab Mansion, mocked in its day as Schwab's Folly, has undergone a posthumous reevaluation. What was once seen as gaudy and ostentatious is now celebrated for its architectural ambition. Historians praise its technological innovations, its French Renaissance detailing, its monumental staircases. The home has become a symbol of how American society reassesses beauty only after it has vanished. And then there is Penn Station, arguably the most significant loss in American architectural history. Like the mansions, Penn Station became more cherished in death than in life. During its final decades, commuters rushed through its halls without looking up. But once it was replaced by cramped underground corridors, the nation understood the magnitude of the tragedy. The station's absence became more powerful than its presence had ever been. This dynamic, the elevation of the demolished, reveals a profound aspect of cultural memory. Absence amplifies significance. People mourn what they can no longer touch. They romanticize what they will never experience. They reconstruct in their minds what progress has erased, and in doing so, they give lost architecture new life. But there is another truth hidden in this phenomenon. The lost mansions did not vanish because they were unloved. They vanished because the structures of society changed faster than the buildings themselves. These homes were built for a lifestyle that no longer exists. They required armies of servants, vast amounts of coal for heating, imported, materials for maintenance, and constant attention from craftsmen. The Gilded Age elite treated their estates as grand stages for elaborate social rituals, balls, musicales, dinner parties, seasonal gatherings. As the 20th century progressed, those rituals faded. The social world that sustained the mansions dissolved. Electricity replaced gaslight. Automobiles replaced carriages. Apartments replaced private palaces. A new generation of wealth preferred sleek modernity to excessive ornamentation, and so the mansions, no matter how beautiful, became obsolete. Obsolescence, not disdain, sealed their fate. Yet their architectural DNA lives on. If one studies the interiors of New York's modern luxury towers, one finds echoes of Gilded Age design. Double-height foyers, grand staircases, ornate plasterwork, imported stone, custom woodwork, and massive entertaining spaces crafted to attract global elites. The mansions may be gone, but the desire they expressed, the desire to create environments of extreme beauty, remains intact. Similarly, the cultural legacy of the mansions persists in literature, cinema, and art. Every film adaptation of The Great Gatsby invokes the vanished Gold Coast estates. Period dramas set in New York repeatedly recreate Gilded Age ballrooms, using surviving estates as stand-ins. The mansions come alive on screen even though the originals no longer exist. In this way, destruction did not erase them, it immortalized them. Yet perhaps the most meaningful legacy of these lost structures lies in what they taught the city about the relationship between progress and memory. New York learned that modernization without reflection leads to cultural amnesia. It learned that beauty requires advocacy. It learned that architectural heritage cannot survive without legislation. And it learned that once something grand is destroyed, it can never be rebuilt. Not truly, not completely, not with the same soul. The lost mansions serve as reminders that cities, like people, are shaped as much by what they lose as what they create. And still, beneath all the cultural reflection and historical significance, one undeniable truth remains. The lost mansions of Gilded Age New York continue to captivate us because they expose the profound fragility of grandeur. Their stories challenge the assumption that wealth guarantees permanence, reminding us that even the greatest architectural achievements can crumble when the forces of history shift direction. But the fascination goes deeper than the architecture itself. What we are drawn to, whether we realize it or not, are the human stories embedded within these estates. The triumphs, the scandals, the hidden tragedies, and the personal ambitions of those who built them. Each mansion was a living biography, written not with ink, but with marble, wood, silk, and stone. Consider the Schwabs, whose marriage slowly deteriorated inside a palace built to secure happiness. Consider the Vanderbilts, who attempted to craft a dynasty through architecture, only to see their palaces torn apart by time, taxes, shifting values, and the dissolution of old money society. Consider Louis Comfort Tiffany, whose artistic genius blossomed inside his Fifth Avenue mansion, only to witness its destruction in the midst of financial decline. And consider Clara and Clarence Mackay, who orchestrated legendary parties at Harbor Hill, filling its halls with royalty, only for the mansion to become a ruin shortly after their deaths. These were not simply homes. They were stages for human drama on a scale rarely seen in American life. And when the curtain fell, when the wrecking balls arrived, when the grounds were leveled, those dramas did not disappear. They echoed into the present, adding layers of meaning to the ruins left behind. But perhaps the most striking example of this interplay between architecture and human narrative emerges when we study the global context. The Gilded Age mansions of New York were not isolated phenomena. They were part of a larger cultural shift that defined turn-of-the-century America. Wealthy Americans traveled through Europe, saw the great chateaux and palaces of France, Germany, and Italy, and returned home determined to outdo them. This was not merely imitation. It was ambition. The belief that America could compete with centuries-old European grandeur and perhaps even surpass it. And so, the United States, still young and industrial, began producing homes that rivaled European palaces in scale and artistic execution. Architects like McKim, Mead, and White, Richard Morris Hunt, and Stanford White became celebrities, shaping an American aesthetic that blended old-world tradition with new-world audacity. But the American experiment differed from Europe in one crucial way. Europe's aristocratic estates were protected by centuries of tradition and generational continuity. American estates were tied to individuals, not lineages. When those individuals died or their fortunes faded, the estates lacked institutional structures to preserve them. This difference sealed the fate of many Gilded Age mansions. They were designed for a culture that prized rapid ascent, not continuity. When fortunes collapsed, as they inevitably did, the estates collapsed with them. This is why the mansions of Fifth Avenue and the Gold Coast fared differently than European castles. Where France preserved its chateau and Britain its country houses, America replaced its palaces with modern developments. The nation prioritized economic productivity over architectural legacy. Yet even as America erased these structures, it developed something else, a deep reverence for what it lost. This reverence sparked the creation of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, community preservation groups, National Register of Historic Places, architectural archives and photography collections, historic house museums, public campaigns to save endangered buildings. The mansion's destruction was the catalyst that taught America the importance of protecting its architectural heritage. In an ironic twist, the greatest legacy of these lost palaces is not the buildings themselves, but the preservation movement they inspired. Because of them, structures like Grand Central Terminal, the Frick Collection, the Woolworth Building, the Dakota, the U.S. Custom House, Rockefeller Center, countless churches, theaters, and brownstones were saved from demolition. In this sense, the lost mansions became martyrs for the city's architectural soul. Even sites where mansions once stood carry a sense of historical gravity. Walk past the site of the Schwab Mansion, and you may not see towers or turrets, but beneath the pavement lies the memory of a palace once considered the finest residence in New York. Visit the block where the Tiffany Mansion stood, and you stand upon a lost laboratory of American artistry. Walk the length of Fifth Avenue between 51st and 57th, and you tread upon the very ground where an entire dynasty's architectural empire rose and fell. These invisible footprints remain part of the city's identity. But the most unexpected legacy of these vanished estates is found in the city's cultural imagination. The Gilded Age mansions have become symbols of a New York that once existed, a New York of ambition, extravagance, artistic experimentation, and architectural daring. They remind us that the city was once willing to dream in stone. They remind us that beauty, however fleeting, leaves behind a lasting impression. They remind us that eras rise and fall, but their spirit survives through the stories we tell. It is no coincidence that modern audiences are fascinated by the history of the Gilded Age. From documentaries to novels, from Broadway productions to television dramas like The Gilded Age, popular culture has reignited public interest in the opulent world of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And at the center of that fascination lies the architecture. The mansions represent more than wealth. They represent ambition unrestrained. They represent the moment America declared itself ready to stand alongside the great cultural powers of Europe. Their loss represents the moment America realized that preservation required intention, not assumption. The story of the lost mansions is not a simple narrative of destruction. It is a cyclical tale of creation, erasure, remembrance, and reinterpretation. Each generation revisits these structures with new questions, new values, new emotional connections. As the city continues to evolve, these mansions serve as silent guides, reminding us that architecture is not just about shelter, but about meaning. They remind us that every building is a statement about the society that created it, and they remind us that when the wrecking ball swings, it does not merely erase a structure, it erases a worldview. Yet, as we move deeper into the 21st century, a new question emerges, one that historians, architects, and preservationists grapple with continuously. What does it mean to preserve history in a city that is built on constant reinvention? New York's greatest strength, its relentless forward momentum, is also the force that threatens its own architectural memory. This contradiction forms the core of the city's identity. It is at once a guardian of the past and an engine of perpetual change. Nowhere is this tension more visible than in the stories of the Gilded Age mansions that once defined its landscape. Because the truth is this: even as the city accelerates toward the future, it cannot escape the shadows of what it has lost. Walk down Fifth Avenue at night, and if you pause outside the looming facades of modern skyscrapers, you may feel a strange, almost eerie sense of absence, like the echo of footsteps that no longer sound. The street once lined with stone palaces now hums with the glow of luxury retail storefronts, corporate headquarters, and sleek towers of steel and glass. Yet beneath the neon and the window displays lies a buried avenue of vanished aristocracy. The ghosts of the Gilded Age linger here, not in a supernatural sense, but in the cultural memory of the city. Their presence is intangible, yet unmistakable. A kind of architectural afterimage remains imprinted upon the places they once occupied. Fifth Avenue, once nicknamed Millionaires' Row, held some of the most extraordinary private homes in the nation. Residents included the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and numerous other families whose wealth shaped modern America. Their homes formed a corridor of power, a physical manifestation of their financial and social dominance. But the destruction of these palaces also marked the decline of an entire social order. The Gilded Age elite believed in permanence. They believed their dynasties would endure. They believed their homes would symbolize their legacies for centuries. Yet their architectural empires collapsed within a single generation. As America moved into the 20th century, the societal conditions that once empowered these families began to shift. Income taxes, labor movements, economic downturns, and evolving cultural priorities eroded the foundations of old money dominance. The irony is striking. The very ambition that drove these families to build palaces was the same ambition that pushed the city toward modernization, eventually replacing their homes with commercial structures that better served economic growth. And so, the Gilded Age fell not through neglect, but through the natural evolution of a nation. Still, even if the physical structures disappeared, the idea of the Gilded Age never fully died. Its imagery continues to fascinate because it captures a moment when the country's wealth and creativity exploded with unprecedented force. The mansions served as architectural proclamations. America has arrived. This is why their destruction remains so poignant. Each demolished estate symbolizes a broken promise, an interrupted narrative of beauty, artistry, and cultural ambition. The city lost not just buildings, but an opportunity to preserve a chapter of American history in its original form. What remains today are fragments. A surviving gatehouse here, a carriage house repurposed there, a lone stone wall hidden behind modern construction, a salvaged staircase in a museum, a fountain relocated to a suburban garden, a set of stained glass windows preserved in a private collection. These remnants serve as the last physical touchpoints of an era that once dominated the American imagination. But to truly appreciate the magnitude of the loss, one must study the craftsmanship that went into these homes. The artisans of the Gilded Age possessed skills that have become exceedingly rare. They carved stone by hand, shaped iron with fire, painted frescoes with European precision, and crafted woodwork with an artistry that modern machinery cannot replicate. Today, preservation architects often express frustration when working with surviving Gilded Age structures. They note that reproducing the original craftsmanship is nearly impossible. The carving techniques, decorative plaster skills, and specialized trades that once flourished have largely disappeared. This realization amplifies the tragedy of the demolitions. The mansions were not just lost, they were irreplaceable even in their own time. To lose such structures is to lose a form of human knowledge. And yet, the story of loss continues to unfold in unexpected ways. In recent years, a new movement has emerged, one that blends historical preservation with modern reinterpretation. Rather than restoring entire neighborhoods to their Gilded Age appearance, architects are integrating fragments of historic design into contemporary spaces. Elements of lost mansions, such as cast iron ornaments, decorative tiles, and salvaged stonework, now appear in lobbies of modern buildings and public parks. This blending of old and new represents a philosophical shift. Instead of viewing the past as something preserved in a static state, the city is beginning to treat its history as a living resource, something that can be woven into future architectural expressions. The Dakota, for instance, stands as a rare example of a Gilded Age residential building that not only survived but continues to thrive. It has maintained its architectural integrity, its cultural relevance, and its place in the collective imagination. Its continuing prestige demonstrates that survival is possible, but only when a structure maintains both physical durability and cultural significance. Contrast this with the fate of the Vanderbilt mansions, which vanished almost entirely from Fifth Avenue. Their destruction forced the city to reconsider the consequences of unchecked development, sparking a new consciousness around heritage. And nowhere is this shift more visible than in the dramatic case of Penn Station. When the station fell, the city awoke. The shock ignited a passion for preservation that no previous demolition had ever stirred. The public realized that history could not defend itself, and that beauty would disappear unless people fought for it. The movement that arose from Penn Station's loss fundamentally reshaped New York's relationship with its architectural past. It established legal protections, inspired grassroots activism, and permanently altered the trajectory of urban planning. In a very real sense, the lost mansions built the modern preservation movement, not through their existence, but through their destruction. Their absence transformed into a call to action, a mandate to protect the cultural fabric of the city. Today, the preservation movement is stronger than ever. Buildings once threatened with demolition, such as the Seagram Building, Grand Central Terminal, and countless historic districts, now enjoy protections that did not exist when the Gilded Age palaces were erased. This is the paradox of the lost mansions. Their destruction saved future landmarks. Yet the question remains, what would New York look like today if the mansions had survived? Would Fifth Avenue be a canyon of stone palaces instead of modern skyscrapers? Would the Gold Coast still shimmer with colossal estates instead of suburban homes? Would Gilded Age design have shaped the modern American aesthetic in ways we cannot imagine? These hypothetical questions deepen the aura of the lost mansions, elevating them into a realm of imagination and longing. For history is not only about what happened, but what could have happened. And the lost mansions of Gilded Age New York stand at the crossroads of both. As we continue tracing the vanished world of Gilded Age New York, it becomes clear that these lost mansions did something few buildings ever achieve. They reshaped not only the skyline, but the psychology of an entire era. Their creation expressed a national ambition, an urge for cultural legitimacy, artistic distinction, and social dominance. Their destruction revealed a nation shedding its gilded facade in pursuit of modernity. But the question persists. Why do these structures continue to haunt us? Why does their absence feel so present? To understand this, we must examine not only the architectural details or the social histories, but the symbolic role these mansions played in the American imagination. They were more than homes. They were manifestations of a worldview that believed beauty should be monumental, that wealth should be visible, and that America deserved its own palaces. In a developing nation hungry for recognition, these homes served as cultural proof, tangible evidence that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with Europe. To demolish them was, in a sense, to dismantle the physical embodiment of that early American ambition. Yet, in a paradoxical twist, their destruction also marked the maturing of the nation. America no longer needed marble palaces to prove its cultural worth. Its identity evolved beyond aristocratic mimicry. Its power no longer depended on ostentatious architectural statements. The skyscraper, efficient, vertical, modern, became the new symbol of American strength. The transition from mansions to towers reflects a profound shift in values, a shift from private grandeur to public achievement, from individual wealth to corporate power, from crafted ornament to streamlined efficiency, from inherited luxury to earned opportunity. This evolution mirrors the transformation of the American dream itself. But while the skyscraper became the defining icon of the 20th century, the memory of the Gilded Age mansions continues to exert an emotional gravitational pull. They represent not just wealth, but artistry, an element often missing from the glass and steel modernity that replaced them. For all their excess, the mansions possessed something intangible that resonates today: romantic grandeur. Their sweeping staircases, gilded ceilings, marble halls, stained glass windows, and formal gardens evoke a cinematic world that feels larger than life. Modern architecture often prioritizes function over ornament, efficiency over imagination. The Gilded Age mansions remind us that architecture can be storytelling, an expression of identity, aspiration, and fantasy. This longing for beauty helps explain the recent resurgence of interest in the Gilded Age. Television dramas, documentaries, social media channels, and historical books have reintroduced the era to a new generation hungry for stories of elegance, complexity, and ambition. The mansions, once dismissed as symbols of oppressive wealth, are now reinterpreted as lost masterpieces of craftsmanship. Their allure is heightened by the fact that we cannot visit them. Their rooms exist only in photographs, their staircases only in archived blueprints, their ballrooms only in written descriptions, their gardens only in memories recorded decades after their disappearance. In a world saturated with virtual access, the inability to physically experience these spaces creates a rare form of mystique. And so the lost mansions occupy a unique space between history and myth. Real, documented structures that nonetheless feel like legend. This mythic quality becomes especially evident when we examine the public response to vanished landmarks. Urban explorers, historians, artists, writers, and filmmakers return repeatedly to the themes these mansions evoke: excess, ambition, nostalgia, downfall, reinvention, and legacy. Nowhere is this more evident than in the continued fascination with The Great Gatsby. The novel endures because it speaks to universal human desires: hope, reinvention, longing, and the seductive pull of the past. The mansions that inspired the novel amplify these themes. Each demolished estate becomes a metaphor for unattainable dreams, unfulfilled desires, and the brutal consequences of time. But the emotional resonance of these estate stories extends beyond literature. They invite us to reflect on the nature of preservation itself, because preservation is not only about saving buildings, it is about defining what a society chooses to remember, and what it allows itself to forget. When the Vanderbilt mansions fell, the city chose progress over heritage. When the Tiffany mansion disappeared, it chose practicality over artistry. When Penn Station was demolished, it chose economic expediency over civic beauty. These decisions reveal not only architectural priorities, but cultural values. Today, the pendulum has swung back. The city now recognizes the irreplaceable value of historic architecture, not because it resists progress, but because it understands that beauty and memory enrich urban life. Modern preservation advocates fight for buildings not simply because they are old, but because they carry meaning, stories that inform the identity of the city. The lost mansions serve as cautionary tales. They remind us that preservation must be proactive, not reactionary. Once a building falls, the decision is irreversible. And yet, while their physical forms vanished, their stories continue to guide the city's future. The mansions taught New York that legacy is fragile. They taught it that cultural heritage is not guaranteed. They taught it that beauty must be defended. This awareness has shaped entire districts, from Brooklyn Heights to Soho to the Upper West Side, where historic buildings were saved from demolition because the city had already experienced the consequences of losing too much. The irony is profound. The mansions that were destroyed helped preserve the mansions that survived. Their loss became a warning that reshaped laws, activism, preservation policies, and public consciousness. Without the destruction of those Gilded Age palaces, much more of New York's architectural history would have disappeared. Yet despite their absence, the lost mansions continue to feel alive. Artists sketch them, historians write about them, archivists restore their photographs, digital modelers recreate their interiors, tourists visit the sites where they once stood, and New Yorkers, knowingly or unknowingly, walk through the city influenced by their ghostly presence. The mansions may be gone, but their imprint remains woven into the cultural DNA of New York. Because cities, like people, are shaped not only by what they build, but by what they lose. To understand the full impact of these lost mansions, one must recognize that their disappearance did not simply erase structures, it altered the psychological landscape of New York. In their absence, the city's collective memory was forced to contend with a profound question: what does it mean to lose beauty on a monumental scale? Architectural loss is unlike any other. When a painting is destroyed, a single artifact vanishes. When a mansion is demolished, an entire world disappears. Rooms where decisions were made, where parties glittered into dawn, where families lived out dramas both public and private, all of it evaporates in an instant. The destruction is not only physical, it is emotional, cultural, and historical. This is why the fate of the Gilded Age mansions continues to provoke such strong responses. Their erasure represents a rupture in continuity. When modern buildings rise in their place, the city does not merely look different, it feels different. In many ways, the mansions served as emotional anchors. They grounded the city in its own story, reminding residents of the ambitions, struggles, and triumphs that built New York. Their disappearance created a void not easily filled by steel and glass. Moreover, the Gilded Age estates embodied an artistry that no longer exists at scale. Their construction required armies of artisans, stonemasons, woodcarvers, fresco painters, ironworkers, muralists, stained glass craftsmen. Many of these trades were in decline by the mid-20th century, replaced by prefabricated components and industrialized building techniques. Thus, when a mansion fell, it took an entire constellation of craftsmanship with it, skills passed down through generations, lost as surely as the buildings they once adorned. This gives the lost mansions an additional layer of poignancy. They represent not only vanished spaces, but vanished labor, vanished knowledge, vanished artistic traditions. Modern New Yorkers, confronted with sleek towers of reflective glass, often feel a nostalgia they cannot fully articulate. It is not merely a longing for the past, it is a yearning for texture, for detail, for ornamentation that engages the senses. The Gilded Age mansions offered environments of tactile richness: carved balustrades, mosaic floors, velvet draperies, marble fireplaces, gilded ceilings. These were buildings meant to be experienced, not simply inhabited. Their destruction marked a turning point, signaling the ascendancy of a new architectural philosophy, one that prized efficiency over expression, functionality over fantasy. But fantasy was precisely what the Gilded Age excelled at. These homes were theatrical environments, stages upon which America projected its dreams. Their architects borrowed freely from European traditions: French chateaux, Italian palazzos, English manors, German Renaissance courts, yet reinterpreted them with a distinctly American boldness. The result was a cultural hybrid: old-world grandeur infused with new-world ambition. When New York demolished these mansions, it dismantled this architectural mythology. Yet, paradoxically, this loss made the mythology stronger. The buildings became more romantic in death than they had ever been in life. Their absence created a longing that fuels the imagination. This nostalgia manifests in numerous ways: scholarly works, documentaries, historical exhibits, architectural renderings, and, increasingly, digital reconstructions. As technology advances, archivists and designers are using 3D modeling to rebuild lost mansions virtually. These digital recreations, though imperfect, offer glimpses into vanished worlds, allowing modern audiences to walk through spaces that no longer exist. And still, even with this digital revival, nothing can replicate the emotional power of the originals. The weight of the marble, the glow of the chandeliers, the echo of footsteps in vaulted halls, the scent of varnished wood and aged tapestry. The tragedy of their destruction becomes even more evident when one considers the speed at which these homes vanished. Many lasted barely 25 to 50 years, shorter lifespans than the people who built them. Their demolition was not the slow fading of old architecture, but a rapid, violent erasure driven by real estate economics and shifting cultural priorities. This speed of disappearance left little time for reflection. Only after they were gone did the public begin to grasp what had been lost. This retrospective horror was most powerfully expressed during the demolition of Pennsylvania Station, a moment when New York awakened to the cost of unchecked modernization. The station's destruction became a cultural trauma, a moment when the nation realized that progress without preservation results not in improvement, but in amputation. The lost mansions represent the same lesson, only earlier and more quietly. They lacked the public visibility of Penn Station, but their disappearance laid the groundwork for the preservation movement. Each demolished estate was a silent warning, a prelude to the outcry that would eventually protect buildings like Grand Central Terminal. Yet, for all their grandeur, the mansions also reveal the contradictions of the Gilded Age. They symbolize inequality, excess, and the concentration of wealth. They remind us that beauty often emerges from imbalance, that artistic brilliance can coexist with social inequity. This duality gives the lost mansions a complexity that transcends nostalgia. They are neither purely admirable nor purely condemnable. They are historical artifacts that force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that great beauty can arise from problematic circumstances. And perhaps that is why they continue to resonate today. We live in an era of reckoning, economically, socially, architecturally. The mansions serve as mirrors, reflecting our own debates about wealth, power, preservation, and progress. They compel us to ask enduring questions. What should a city remember? What should it allow itself to forget? What is the cost of beauty? What is the value of history? And who gets to decide? Their destruction teaches us that cities evolve through tension between ambition and restraint, innovation and tradition, profit and culture. The mansions were born from ambition and destroyed for profit. Their memory survives because of culture. In this way, they embody the full spectrum of New York's identity, its brilliance, its contradictions, its capacity for reinvention. And so, even in their absence, the lost mansions of Gilded Age New York remain foundational. They built the city's character as surely as they shaped its skyline. Their ruins, visible or invisible, continue to guide its development, because a city remembers even what it no longer contains. To truly grasp the legacy of the lost mansions, we must consider how they interacted with the city around them. These homes were not isolated monuments. They were part of a broader social and urban ecosystem that defined the Gilded Age. Their rise mirrored the ascent of industrial capitalism, and their fall mirrored its transformation. In many ways, each demolished mansion represents a chapter in the evolution of American identity. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of their story is how deliberately they were crafted to impress. The Gilded Age elite believed architecture was not merely personal expression, it was public performance, A mansion was a declaration of status, taste, lineage, and power. It was a way of asserting legitimacy in a rapidly changing nation. This performative dimension was essential because the American aristocracy was not centuries old, it was newly minted. Families like the Vanderbilts, Astors, Mackays, Fricks, and Rockefellers were builders of industries, not inheritors of titles. Their fortunes emerged from steel, railroads, oil, finance, and manufacturing. Their palaces, therefore, served as architectural narratives, stories carved in stone to signal permanence in a world of rapid expansion. Yet this pursuit of grandeur had unintended consequences. The sheer scale of these homes made them almost impossible to sustain across generations. Heirs lacked the desire, resources, or cultural inclination to maintain residences that required dozens of servants and constant upkeep. As America embraced modernity, the old rhythms of household management faded away. The domestic labor required to maintain a 75-room chateau or a 100,000-square-foot estate no longer existed in the same form. The homes were too large to be repurposed easily, too ornate to be renovated affordably, and too expensive to maintain in a city where every square foot of land increased dramatically in value. And so, demolition became not only common, but inevitable. But while the economic rationale for their destruction is easy to understand, the emotional fallout is far more complicated. With each demolished mansion, the city felt a subtle shift, an erosion of character, a loss of architectural diversity, a thinning of cultural memory. These homes had personalities, presence, atmosphere. They shaped the streets around them. Their disappearance created a form of architectural amnesia. New York reinvented itself so often that it nearly forgot what it had once been. It is only in hindsight that we can appreciate the full magnitude of what was lost. Consider the Tiffany Mansion, whose destruction is now regarded as a foundational tragedy of architectural history. Or the grandeur of Schwab's Riverside Drive Palace, erased so thoroughly that only fragments survive in Brooklyn's churches. Or the Vanderbilt Triple Palace, which once commanded Fifth Avenue with unparalleled magnificence before being replaced by anonymous commercial buildings. The irony is striking. The structures meant to symbolize permanence often proved the most fragile. Nowhere is this irony more evident than in the case of Penn Station. Its demolition shocked a nation because it made plain the consequences of progress untempered by preservation. The public realized that if such a monumental building could be destroyed, nothing was safe. This awakening reshaped preservation laws nationwide. But what many forget is that the mansion suffered a similar fate long before Penn Station. Their disappearance paved the way for the cultural shift that eventually protected landmarks like Grand Central Terminal. Without the earlier losses, without Schwab, Tiffany, Vanderbilt, and countless other estates falling, the outrage that saved future buildings might never have existed. In this sense, the lost mansions became martyrs of architectural history. Their destruction bought wisdom, awareness, and cultural maturity. They taught a city how to grieve, how to remember, and ultimately, how to protect what remained. Yet this form of preservation through loss raises another question. Were the mansions destined to fall from the moment they were built? To answer that, we must consider the nature of the Gilded Age itself. The era was defined by extremes, extreme inequality, extreme ambition, extreme opulence. Its architecture reflected these extremes. Homes were not designed merely for living, but for spectacle. They were stage sets for an aristocracy still inventing its own rituals. This spectacle, however, was fragile. It depended on a continuous flow of wealth, social currency, and cultural relevance. When any one of these pillars weakened, the entire structure became vulnerable. The Great Depression stripped many families of fortunes. Shifting tax laws discouraged excessive displays of wealth. Urbanization demanded more efficient land use. Modern aesthetics rejected ornamentation as outdated and wasteful. Younger generations viewed the mansions as burdens rather than legacies. Thus, the mansions became victims of changing values as much as changing economics.